Some things in life can't be bought twice. When Alexander Stratton inherited his father's 1955 Jaguar XK140, he inherited more than a car. He inherited 30 years of Sunday drives, fishing trips, and quiet conversations that shaped who he became. Now the car sits broken in his garage. The engine won't start. The best mechanics in the world have tried and failed. Alexander has spent thousands trying to fix it, but nothing works. Then someone tells him about an Amish man in Pennsylvania who fixes things with his hands. Alexander thinks it's crazy. What could someone without modern tools know about a fancy British car? But sometimes when you've lost something precious, you'll try anything to get it back. What happens when a billionaire meets a simple craftsman over a broken dream? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander Stratton's Manhattan penthouse, casting long shadows across the polished marble floor. He stood in his silk pajamas, coffee cup in hand, staring down at the city that never seemed to sleep. At 62, Alexander had everything a man could want: wealth beyond measure, a business empire that spanned 3 continents, and respect from peers who measured success in zeros at the end of bank statements. Yet, as he watched the ant-like figures hurrying along the sidewalks 40 floors below, he felt a familiar emptiness settling in his chest like morning fog dot. His reflection in the window showed a man who had aged well. Silver hair perfectly styled, shoulders still broad from years of tennis and swimming. But the eyes told a different story. They held the weariness of someone who had climbed every mountain, only to discover the view from the top was lonelier than expected. The phone buzzed on his marble kitchen island. "Mr. Stratton?" His assistant's voice was crisp and efficient. "Your 9 o'clock is here early. The Henderson merger documents need your signature before noon, and your son called. What did James want?" Alexander interrupted, his heart quickening at the mention of his only child. He didn't say, "Just ask me to have you call him back when convenient." Alexander set down his coffee cup with a soft clink. James never called anymore. Their relationship had grown as cold as the marble beneath his feet, each conversation more stilted than the last. At 35, James lived in California, as far from his father's world as he could manage while still remaining in the same country. The last time they had really spoken, was at his wife Margaret's funeral 3 years ago. Even then, their words had been careful, formal, like strangers sharing an elevator. "Tell Mr. Henderson I'll be down in 20 minutes, Alexander said, already moving toward his bedroom. The business always came first. It had to. That's what his own father had taught him, and look how well that had served the Stratton name. 3 generations of success, each man building higher than the last, each man sacrificing a little more of his soul on the altar of achievement. As Alexander dressed in his perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his eyes fell on the silver-framed photograph on his dresser. It showed a younger version of himself standing beside a gleaming British racing green Jaguar, his arm around a boy of perhaps 12, with gap-toothed grin and eyes full of hero worship. James. The photo had been taken the day Alexander's father died, though neither of them knew it at the time. They had spent that afternoon working on the Jaguar together in the garage, James eagerly handing his father tools and asking endless questions about carburetors and timing chains. The Jaguar. Even now, 20 years later, the thought of that car sent a pang of loss through Alexander's chest. It sat in his climate-controlled garage 3 floors below, as broken and silent as his relationship with his son. For months now, he had been trying to get it running again, hiring the best mechanics money could buy. Each expert arrived with confidence and left with apologies. The car had defeated them all. Alexander's father had bought the 1955 Jaguar XK140 the year Alexander was born, and it had been the third member of their family ever since. Every Sunday after church, the three of them would pile into that car for long drives through the Connecticut countryside. His mother would pack a picnic basket. His father would wear his old leather driving gloves, and Alexander would sit in the back seat, watching the world blur past through the curved rear window. Those drives had been the foundation of Alexander's childhood. His father, stern and demanding in business, would transform behind the wheel of that Jaguar. He would tell stories about the car's adventures, teach Alexander to identify different bird calls, or simply drive in comfortable silence while the engine purred like a contented cat. After his mother died when Alexander was 16, those drives became even more precious. The only time father and son could connect without the weight of expectations and disappointments pressing down on them. When Alexander's father passed away 15 years later, he left behind a business empire and a set of keys. Alexander inherited both, but he treasured the keys more than all the companies and investments combined. The Jaguar represented something pure from his past, something untainted by the compromises and cruel calculations of adult life. For years, Alexander had maintained the car religiously. He drove it every Sunday, continuing the tradition his father had started. When James was young, he had ridden in the back seat, just as Alexander once had, and those drives had been the brightest spots in Alexander's increasingly complicated life. But as James grew older and Alexander grew busier, the Sunday drives became monthly, then seasonal, then memories. The car had been running perfectly until 6 months ago, when the engine simply refused to start one crisp October morning. At first, Alexander assumed it was a minor issue, a dead battery, or fouled spark plugs. But as mechanic after mechanic examined the vehicle, the diagnoses grew more dire. The transmission was failing. The electrical system was shorting out. Decades of careful maintenance couldn't prevent the simple fact that mechanical things eventually wear out, no matter how much love and money you pour into them. Alexander had spent over $50,000 on repair attempts. He had flown in specialists from England who claimed to know these old Jaguars better than their own mothers. He had contacted vintage car collectors, restoration experts, and mechanical wizards who promised miracles for the right price. Each had failed. The car sat in his garage like a beautiful corpse, all gleaming paint and chrome, hiding a heart that would no longer beat. The failure of the mechanics hurt worse than Alexander cared to admit. In a world where money could solve almost any problem, where Alexander's wealth could move mountains and reshape skylines, this simple machine had humbled him completely. It was as if the car was punishing him for something, though he couldn't imagine what. 3 days ago, his driver Michael had mentioned something in passing that stuck in Alexander's mind like a splinter. Michael's cousin lived in rural Pennsylvania, in Amish country, and he claimed there was a man there who could fix anything with wheels. Works miracles with his hands, Michael had said. Doesn't use computers or fancy diagnostic equipment. Just looks at a machine and understands what's wrong with it, like he can hear what it's trying to say. Alexander had laughed at the suggestion. What could some Amish craftsman possibly know about a sophisticated British sports car? The very idea seemed absurd. These people didn't even use electricity in their daily lives. They traveled by horse and buggy, farmed with hand tools, and lived as if the modern world had never been invented. Asking one of them to repair a precision-engineered automobile would be like asking a blacksmith to perform brain surgery. But as the days passed and the Jaguar continued to sit silent and still, the suggestion began to seem less ridiculous. Alexander had tried everything else. Every conventional approach had failed. What did he have to lose? Yesterday, he had finally swallowed his pride and called Michael's cousin. The conversation had been brief and awkward. The cousins seemed as skeptical about Alexander's intentions as Alexander felt about the whole endeavor. But eventually, the man had provided a name and directions. Josiah Fisher, a craftsman who lived near Lancaster, Pennsylvania, who reportedly had a gift for understanding the souls of broken machines. Now, as Alexander straightened his tie and prepared for another day of meetings and decisions that would affect thousands of lives, he found himself thinking about that name, Josiah Fisher. It sounded like something from a different century, from a world where men worked with their hands and measured time by seasons, instead of stock market cycles. Alexander made a decision that surprised even him. He walked to his desk and picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found his assistant's number. "Cancel my appointments for the rest of the week," he said when she answered. "Sir, the Henderson merger can wait. I'm driving to Pennsylvania." "Pennsylvania?" "Mr. Stratton, you have the board meeting on Thursday, and the investors from Tokyo will have to reschedule." Alexander was already moving toward his closet, pulling out more casual clothes than he had worn in months. "I have something more important to take care of." As he changed into khakis and a polo shirt, Alexander caught sight of himself in the mirror again. Without the armor of his business suit, he looked older, more vulnerable, like a man who had spent so much time building walls that he had forgotten what lay beyond them. The Jaguar's keys felt heavy in his hand as he rode the elevator down to the garage. The car sat where it always did, in the spot closest to the elevator, covered by a pristine car cover that Alexander removed with the reverence of a priest unveiling an altar. The British racing green paint gleamed under the garage's fluorescent lights, the chrome bumpers and wire wheels polishing to mirror brightness. It was still the most beautiful machine Alexander had ever seen. He climbed behind the wheel and turned the key, knowing what would happen, but hoping anyway. The dashboard lights flickered weakly and died. The engine didn't even attempt to turn over. Alexander sat in the silence for a long moment, his hands resting on the thin steering wheel, breathing in the familiar scent of leather and old dreams. "I'm going to fix you," he whispered to the car, the words barely audible in the concrete space. "I don't know how, but I'm going to fix you." He climbed out and walked to where his modern Mercedes waited, black and efficient and utterly soulless. In 30 minutes, he would be on the road to Pennsylvania, driving toward a world he didn't understand in search of answers he wasn't sure he wanted to hear. But for the first time in months, Alexander felt something stirring in his chest that he had almost forgotten hope. The city sprawled out below him as he drove through the Holland Tunnel, and Alexander found himself wondering what his father would think of this quest. Would he understand the desperation that drove his son towards such an unlikely solution? Or would he shake his head at the folly of trusting something so precious to someone so different from their world? As the miles rolled beneath his wheels, carrying him away from everything familiar and certain, Alexander allowed himself to imagine the impossible, the sound of the Jaguar's engine coming back to life, purring with the same contentment he remembered from childhood. It was a foolish dream, perhaps, but it was the only dream he had left. The Pennsylvania countryside rolled past Alexander's Mercedes like pages from a forgotten storybook. Rolling hills dotted with red barns and white farmhouses stretched to the horizon, while horse-drawn buggies shared narrow roads with pickup trucks and minivans. Alexander had been driving for 3 hours, and with each mile, the world outside his windows seemed to move a little slower, breathe a little deeper. His GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving him to navigate by handwritten directions that Michael's cousin had provided over the phone. "Look for the big oak tree with the tire swing," the instructions read. "Turn left at the covered bridge. Josiah's place is the third farm on the right, white house with a red barn." Alexander felt increasingly out of place in his luxury sedan. Every vehicle he passed seemed practical and worn trucks carrying hay bales, modest sedans driven by families in plain clothes, even the occasional horse and buggy clip-clopping along the shoulder. His Mercedes with its gleaming paint and New York plates might as well have been a spaceship. Finally, he spotted the covered bridge, a charming wooden structure that looked like something from a postcard. He turned left, as instructed, and found himself on an even narrower road that wound between cornfields and pastures where black and white cows grazed peacefully. The third farm on the right was exactly as described, a simple white farmhouse with green shutters and a large red barn that had weathered to the color of dried blood. A hand-painted sign near the mailbox read, J. Fisher Furniture and Repairs. No website, no phone number, no indication that this was anything more than a modest family business. Alexander pulled into the gravel driveway, his tires crunching loudly in the rural quiet dot as he climbed out of the car. The silence struck him. First, no traffic noise, no construction sounds, no constant hum of air conditioning units and electrical transformers that formed the soundtrack of city life. Just the gentle lowing of cattle in a distant field, and the whisper of wind through corn stalks. A man emerged from the barn, and Alexander knew immediately that this must be Josiah Fisher. He was perhaps 50 years old, with a full brown beard streaked with gray and kind eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore dark pants, a light blue shirt, and a wide-brimmed straw hat that had seen better days. His hands, Alexander noticed, were the hands of someone who worked with them every day strong, calloused but gentle in their movements. "You must be Mr. Stratton," Josiah said, approaching with measured steps. His voice carried a slight accent that Alexander couldn't quite place, not quite German, but something old-world and careful. "Michael's cousin said you might be coming by." Alexander extended his hand, and Josiah shook it with a grip that was firm but not challenging. "Thank you for agreeing to see me, Mr. Fisher. I know this must seem unusual. Josiah, please." And, yes, it is unusual. A man from New York City coming all this way for a broken car. Josiah's eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, suggesting either amusement or kindness, possibly both. "Tell me about this automobile of yours." Alexander found himself fumbling for words. How could he explain what the Jaguar meant to him? How could he describe the desperation that had driven him to seek help from someone who lived without modern conveniences? "It's a 1955 Jaguar XK140, he began. Reddish racing green. My father bought it new, and I inherited it when he passed away. It's been running perfectly for decades, but 6 months ago, it just stopped. The engine won't turn over. The electrical system is failing, and every mechanic I've hired says it's beyond repair." Josiah listened without interruption, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. When Alexander finished, the Amish man was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past Alexander's shoulder towards something only he could see. "A 1955 Jaguar," Josiah said finally. "I've never worked on one of those. British engineering. Very different from what I usually see. May I ask what made you think to come here?" The question hung in the air between them like morning mist. Alexander felt heat rise in his cheeks. How could he explain that he had exhausted every rational option? That in his desperation, he was willing to trust a stranger who didn't even use electricity? "I've tried everything else," Alexander admitted. "Every expert in the country has looked at it. They all say the same thing: the car is too old, too complicated, too far gone. But I can't accept that. This car," he paused, searching for the right words, "this car is all I have left of my father, of the man I used to be before I became this." He gestured at his expensive clothes, his luxury car, the whole package of success that suddenly felt like a costume he couldn't take off. Josiah studied him with those quiet eyes, and Alexander had the uncomfortable feeling that the man could see straight through him to places Alexander had forgotten existed. "Where is the car now?" Josiah asked. Back in New York. I didn't want to assume you'd be willing to help, and I wasn't sure how to get it here. That's wise. I don't make promises about fixing things until I've had a chance to listen to them. Listen to them? Every machine has something to say, Mr. Stratton. Most people are too busy talking to hear it. Before Alexander could ask what that meant, a woman emerged from the farmhouse. She was perhaps 45, with graying hair pinned back under a white cap and the same kind, intelligent eyes as her husband. She wore a dark blue dress that fell to her ankles and an apron that spoke of practical work rather than kitchen decoration. This is my wife, Martha, Josiah said. Martha, this is Mr. Stratton from New York City, the one with the broken automobile. Martha nodded politely, wiping her hands on her apron. You've come a long way for help with the car. Yes, ma'am. I know it probably seems foolish. Not foolish, Martha interrupted gently. Desperate, perhaps. There's a difference. She studied his face with the same penetrating kindness as her husband. When something matters enough, a person will travel any distance to save it. 3 children appeared from behind the barn, drawn by the unusual sight of an expensive car in their driveway. The oldest, a boy of perhaps 14, hung back shyly, but the 2 younger girls, maybe 8 and 10, approached with the fearless curiosity of children. Is that your car? The younger girl asked, pointing at the Mercedes. It's very shiny. Yes, it is, Alexander replied, suddenly uncertain how to talk to children. It had been years since he'd had a real conversation with anyone under 20. But it's not the car I need help with. The broken one is prettier, I bet, the older girl said, with startling confidence. Alexander found himself smiling, the first genuine smile he'd managed in weeks. Yes, it is much prettier. Josiah watched this exchange with interest. If you're willing to bring your automobile here, I'm willing to take a look at it. But I should warn you, my methods are different from what you're probably used to. I don't use computers or electronic diagnostic tools. I work with my hands and my eyes, and whatever wisdom the Lord has given me. It might take time, and there are no guarantees. Alexander felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. Time I have. As for guarantees, well, everyone else has guaranteed me it can't be fixed, so no guarantee seems like an improvement. There's something else, Josiah said, his voice growing more serious. If I agree to work on your car, you'll need to be patient. Not just with the repair, but with the process. Things happen at their own pace here. We don't rush machines back to health, any more than we'd rush a wounded animal. Alexander nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was agreeing to. In his world, everything moved at the speed of urgency. Deals closed overnight, fortunes shifted with phone calls, and patience was a luxury that shareholders didn't appreciate. How long do you think it might take? He asked. Could be days. Could be weeks. Depends on what the car tells me once it gets here. Days or weeks. Alexander tried to imagine being away from his office, his meetings, his carefully structured life, for that long. The thought should have been terrifying, but instead, it felt like the first deep breath he'd taken in years. I'll have it transported here tomorrow, he said. Is there a hotel nearby where I could stay? Josiah and Martha exchanged a look, one of those wordless conversations that long-married couples could have with just their eyes. There's a bed and breakfast about 15 miles toward Lancaster, Martha said. But if you don't mind simple accommodations, we have a room here. Nothing fancy, but it's clean and quiet. The offer surprised Alexander. In his world, business was conducted at arm's length, with contracts and liability waivers and careful professional distance. The idea of staying in the home of someone he'd just met seemed both risky and strangely appealing. I wouldn't want to impose. No imposition, Josiah said firmly. If we're going to work together on healing your automobile, It's better if you're close by. Machines respond to their owner's presence, especially ones that carry emotional weight. As Alexander drove away to make arrangements for transporting the Jaguar, he found himself thinking about Josiah's words. Machines respond to their owner's presence. In his rational, technology-driven world, such a statement would be dismissed as superstition. But sitting in his silent garage with his broken car, Alexander had whispered promises and pleas to chrome and steel. Maybe the Amish craftsman understood something that all the experts had missed. Maybe some repairs required more than technical knowledge. Maybe they required faith. The transport truck arrived at Josiah's farm the next morning, rumbling down the gravel drive like a mechanical dinosaur. Alexander watched from the farmhouse porch as the driver maneuvered the massive trailer into position, its diesel engine disturbing the rural quiet. The Jaguar sat secured on the truck's bed, looking smaller and more fragile than he remembered, wrapped in protective blankets like a patient being moved to a new hospital. Alexander had spent the night in the Fisher family's spare bedroom, a simple space with white walls, a handmade quilt, and a single window that looked out over cornfields. He had expected to sleep poorly on the unfamiliar mattress without the familiar hum of city noise, but instead, he had slept more deeply than he had in months. He woke to the sound of a rooster crowing and the gentle bustle of a family beginning. Their day before dawned. Martha had insisted he join them for breakfast: fresh eggs from their own chickens, bread baked that morning, and coffee that somehow tasted richer than the expensive blends he bought in Manhattan. The children had peppered him with polite questions about city life, while Josiah quietly observed, those thoughtful eyes missing nothing. Now, as the truck driver operated the hydraulic lift to lower the Jaguar to ground level, Alexander felt a familiar tightness in his chest. Seeing his father's car in the setting surrounded by farm buildings and grazing cattle instead of chrome and concrete felt surreal, like watching a movie of someone else's life. Josiah approached the car with the careful reverence of someone visiting a sick friend. He walked slowly around the vehicle, his hands clasped behind his back, taking in every detail of its lines and proportions. The morning sun caught the British racing green paint, making it glow like a jewel against the weathered wood of the barn. "Beautiful machine," Josiah said quietly. "You can see the pride that went into building it." Alexander signed the transport driver's paperwork and watched the big truck rumble away, leaving the Jaguar looking oddly vulnerable on the gravel. Josiah continued his slow inspection, occasionally bending to examine a detail more closely, but never touching the car without permission. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the driver's door. "Of course." Josiah opened the door and leaned inside, not sitting, but simply observing the interior. His eyes moved over the instrument cluster, the leather seats, the worn shift knob that Alexander's father had polished smooth with decades of use. When he straightened, his expression was thoughtful. "This car has been loved," he said simply. Alexander felt unexpected emotion rise in his throat. "Yes, my father cared for it like it was family. I can tell. The wear patterns, the way certain surfaces are polished from gentle handling. This automobile lived a good life before it became sick." Josiah moved to the front of the car and gestured for Alexander to help him raise the long, elegant hood. The engine bay revealed itself like an open book, all chrome and cast iron and precisely routed cables. To Alexander, it looked impossibly complex, a maze of components that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Josiah studied the engine with the same careful attention he had given the exterior, but now he began to touch things. His hands moved over the components with surprising gentleness, fingers tracing fuel lines and electrical connections as if he were reading Braille. "These old English engines," he said, "they're temperamental, but they're also honest. When something goes wrong, they tell you about it if you know how to listen." "What do you hear?" Alexander asked, Right now, confusion? This engine has been worked on by many hands, each with different ideas about how to fix it. Like a conversation where everyone is talking, but nobody is listening. Josiah straightened and wiped his hands on a cloth. We'll need to start by understanding what the car is trying to say, not what we think it should be saying. Alexander's phone buzzed in his pocket, probably his assistant, wondering where he was and when he'd be back to sign contracts and attend meetings. For the first time in decades, he ignored it. Over the next hour, Josiah began what he called his introduction to the car. He didn't immediately begin disassembling anything or running diagnostic tests. Instead, he simply spent time with the machine, familiarizing himself with its personality. He showed Alexander how to read the subtle signs of wear and aging, pointing out places where previous mechanics had made repairs or modifications. See here? Josiah indicated a section of the wiring harness. Someone replaced these connections, but they used modern wire that's too rigid for this application. The car is trying to be flexible, but the new parts are fighting it. Alexander watched, fascinated despite himself. In his business world, problems were solved with aggressive action. Deploy resources, hire experts, throw money at obstacles, until they disappeared. But Josiah's approach was almost meditative, requiring patience and careful observation. My son thinks I'm wasting my time here, Alexander said suddenly, surprising himself with the confession. Josiah glanced up from the engine bay. You've spoken to him about this? Not exactly, but I know what he'd say. James thinks I'm obsessed with the past, that I should let go of old things and move on. Alexander ran his hand along the Jaguar's fender. Maybe he's right. What do? You think? The question hung in the air between them. Alexander had spent so much time managing other people's opinions about his decisions that he rarely stopped to consider his own feelings. I think some things are worth saving, he said finally. Even if they're broken. Maybe especially then. Josiah nodded slowly. A man's relationship with his possessions says something about his relationship with everything else. If we only value things when they're perfect and new, what does that say about how we value people? The words hit Alexander harder than he expected. How many relationships had he discarded when they became inconvenient or complicated? How many connections had he abandoned when they required more patience than he was willing to give? Martha appeared at the barn door, carrying a pitcher of lemonade and 2 glasses. Thought you might be thirsty, she said, setting the refreshments on a workbench. How's the patient? Complicated, Josiah replied, accepting a glass gratefully, but not hopeless. She just needs someone to listen to her story before trying to rewrite it. Alexander sipped the lemonade, tart and sweet, and somehow more refreshing than anything he'd tasted in years. Around them, the barn smelled of hay and old wood and honest work. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that slanted through high windows, and somewhere in the distance, he could hear the Fisher children playing in the yard. This is going to sound strange, Alexander said, but I haven't felt this calm in years. Martha smiled. Nothing strange about that. Sometimes we need to step outside our regular world to remember who we really are. As if on cue, Alexander's phone rang. The harsh electronic sound seemed jarring in the peaceful barn, like a fire alarm at a meditation retreat. Alexander looked at the screen, his business partner, calling for the 3rd time that morning. I should take this, he said apologetically, but Josiah was already closing the Jaguar's hood. The car will still be here when you're done. Some conversations? Can't wait, but healing always can. Alexander walked outside to take the call, but as he listened to his partner's urgent concerns about contracts and deadlines and opportunities that would disappear if not seized immediately, he found his eyes drifting back to the barn where Josiah was carefully arranging tools on his workbench. Each implement had its place, and there was no hurry in the man's movements. No sense that time was slipping away with every passing moment. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander wondered what it would be like to live at the speed of seasons instead of seconds, to measure progress in understanding rather than dollars earned. The thought both terrified and intrigued him. When he finished the call and returned to the barn, he found Josiah examining a wooden toolbox that looked older than Alexander himself. The tools inside were worn smooth by generations of use, each one obviously crafted by hand and maintained with care. "My grandfather's tools," Josiah explained, "and his grandfather's before that. Some wisdom gets passed down through the hands, not just through words." Alexander thought about his own legacy buildings with his name on them, companies that bore the Stratton brand, a fortune that would outlive him by centuries. But what wisdom was he passing down? What knowledge that couldn't be bought or sold? As Josiah began the careful process of truly listening to what the Jaguar had to say, Alexander realized he was about to learn something that no amount of money could have taught him: the patience to hear what broken things were trying to tell him, and the wisdom to know that some repairs took more than technical skill. They took understanding, they took time, and sometimes they took the courage to admit that the problem might not be with the machine at all. Alexander's phone died on the second day, and he was surprised by how little he missed it. He discovered this when he reached instinctively for the device after breakfast, intending to check the markets and scan through his usual morning reports. The black screen stared back at him, lifeless as the Jaguar's dashboard. In Manhattan, this would have constituted a minor emergency. His assistant would have been dispatched immediately to deliver a replacement, ensuring he remained connected to the constant flow of information that drove his business empire. But here, sitting on the Fisher family's front porch with a cup of Martha's coffee and watching Josiah's children feed chickens in the yard, the phone's silence felt more like a reprieve than a crisis. "The charger in my car uses a different connector," Alexander told Martha when she asked if he needed help with anything. "There's a phone in the kitchen if you need to call anyone," she offered. Alexander considered this. Who would he call? His assistant, to report that he was still alive and pursuing an admittedly eccentric repair strategy? His business partner, to endure another lecture about missed opportunities and abandoned responsibilities? James, to attempt another stilted conversation that would probably end in polite disappointment? "Thank you, but I think I'll wait," he said. Martha nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sometimes the world can get along without us for a few days. It's humbling to discover we're not as indispensable as we thought. In the barn, Josiah had begun what he called the conversation with the Jaguar. He worked methodically, removing components not to repair them, but to understand them. Each part was examined carefully, cleaned gently, and set aside in a precise arrangement that seemed to make sense only to him. "Tell me about these previous repairs," Josiah said, pointing to a section of the wiring that had clearly been modified. What problems was someone trying to solve? Alexander had to think. Over the years, there had been so many small fixes and upgrades. The original radio stopped working about 10 years ago. A shop in Manhattan installed a new stereo system that looked period correct but used modern electronics. Josiah nodded, his fingers tracing the path of newer wires that snaked through the original harness. "And this?" "The starter was acting up 3 years ago. My mechanic said the original was worn out, so he installed a high-torque replacement that would be more reliable." Josiah made a note in a small notebook. What else? As Alexander recounted the various repairs and modifications, a pattern began to emerge. Each fix had been intended to improve the car's performance or reliability, but Josiah seemed troubled by many of them. "Modern solutions for old problems," he said finally. "Like trying to teach an elderly person to text instead of helping them write a letter. It might work, but it goes against their nature. Are you saying all those repairs were wrong? Not wrong, exactly. But perhaps not right for this particular car. Machines have personalities, Mr. Stratton. This Jaguar was built in a time when things were made to be repaired, not replaced. It expects to be understood, not just fixed. Alexander watched as Josiah carefully removed the modern starter, setting it aside with something approaching reverence, despite his obvious belief that it didn't belong. Can you make the original work again? Possibly. But first, I need to understand why it failed in the first place. Often, when one part breaks, it's because another part isn't doing its job properly. Fix the wrong thing, and you just move the problem somewhere else. This concept fascinated Alexander. In his business world, when something broke, you replaced it with something better, faster, more efficient. The idea that the solution might lie in understanding the relationship between parts. That fixing one thing might require healing the whole system seemed almost revolutionary. Over the lunch of soup and fresh bread that Martha served in her simple kitchen, Alexander found himself drawn into conversations that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market projections. The Fisher children asked him about skyscrapers and subways, their eyes wide with curiosity about a world they'd only heard described. In return, they taught him about caring for animals, the rhythms of farm life, and the satisfaction of work. That produced something tangible at the end of each day. "Do you like living in the city?" asked Hannah, the youngest, at 8 years old, her blonde hair pinned back under a small white cap that made her look like a miniature version of her mother. Alexander paused, a spoonful of Martha's vegetable soup halfway to his mouth. It was such a simple question, but he realized he hadn't considered it in years. Living in Manhattan wasn't something he liked or disliked. It was simply what successful people did. "I'm used to it," he said finally. "It's where my work is." "But, do you like it?" Hannah persisted with the relentless honesty of children. Alexander stopped. The truth was, he couldn't remember the last time he'd enjoyed anything about city life. The noise, the crowds, the constant pressure to be somewhere else, do something more important. "I don't think I've thought about it that way." Josiah's eldest son, Daniel, a serious boy of 14 who seemed older than his years, spoke up. "Papa says when you stop noticing whether you like something, it usually means you don't." After lunch, Alexander followed Josiah back to the barn, but instead of immediately returning to the car, the Amish craftsman led him to a corner where several pieces of furniture in various stages of completion sat waiting for attention. "This is my regular work," Josiah explained, running his hand over the smooth surface of a half-finished dining table. "Furniture that will outlast the people who buy it. Each piece teaches me something about working with stubborn materials." Alexander watched as Josiah picked up a hand plane, adjusting its blade with tiny, precise movements. When the craftsman drew it across a piece of cherry wood, it produced a gossamer-thin shaving that curled like a ribbon. "Cars and furniture aren't so different," Josiah continued, his attention focused on the smooth motion of the plane. "Both require understanding the material you're working with. Both demand patience, and both respond better to gentle persuasion than brute force. Would you mind if I tried that?" Josiah looked up, surprised. "You want to try hand planing?" Alexander nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Something about the smooth, rhythmic motion appealed to him. In his world, everything happened at keyboard speed, quick clicks that moved millions of dollars or changed hundreds of lives. The idea of work that required physical skill and produced visible, immediate results seemed almost exotic. Josiah handed him the plane, positioning Alexander's hands correctly on the tool. "Feel for the grain of the wood. Don't fight it, work with it. The goal is to remove just a whisper of material with each pass." Alexander's first attempt produced a ragged gouge in the wood rather than a delicate shaving. His second effort wasn't. Much better. But as Josiah patiently corrected his grip and stance, something began to click. By his 10th try, he managed to produce a thin, even shaving that brought a smile to the craftsman's weathered face. "There," Josiah said. "You're listening to the wood now instead of arguing with it." They worked in comfortable silence for nearly an hour, the rhythmic whisper of the plane creating a meditative soundtrack. Alexander found his mind clearing in a way it hadn't for years. No deals to analyze, no calls to return, no urgent decisions demanding immediate attention. Just the simple challenge of removing wood shavings without damaging the board beneath. "This is peaceful," Alexander said, as he examined a particularly good shaving. "Most handwork is, once you learn to let the tools do what they're designed to do instead of forcing them to do what you think they should do." When they returned to the Jaguar, Josiah approached the car with the same patient methodology he'd shown with the furniture. He had removed most of the electrical components now, laying them out on clean cloths in an arrangement that looked random to Alexander but clearly made sense to the craftsman. "Here's what I'm seeing," Josiah said, pointing to various parts. "This car has been fighting itself for years. Each repair solved an immediate problem, but created stress somewhere else in the system. It's like," he paused, searching for the right analogy, "like a family where everyone is trying to help, but nobody is talking to each other about what kind of help is actually needed." Alexander felt an uncomfortable recognition in those words. How many business problems had he solved by throwing resources at symptoms instead of addressing root causes? How many relationships had he attempted to fix with expensive gestures instead of honest conversations? So what do? We start over. Strip away all the Band-Aid solutions and get back to what the car was originally designed to be. Then we address the real problems, not just the ones that make noise. As the afternoon wore on, Alexander found himself genuinely useful for the first time in years. Not because of his money or his connections or his ability to make executive decisions, but because he had two hands and was willing to follow instructions. He held components while Josiah examined them, fetched tools from the carefully organized workbench, and gradually began to understand the mechanical poetry of the old engine. "Your father taught you well," Josiah observed as Alexander successfully identified a worn bearing without being prompted. "Actually, I taught myself most of what I know about this car. My father," Alexander paused. "My father was always too busy to spend much time explaining how things worked. He preferred to handle mechanical problems himself." "But you rode with him?" "Yes, every Sunday when I was young." "And you watched him work on the car?" Alexander thought back to those long-ago afternoons in the garage, from a distance. "He didn't like me getting too close when he was concentrating." Josiah was quiet for a moment, his hands still busy with a carburetor component. Sometimes the most important lessons are the ones we never know we're teaching. Your father might not have shown you how to rebuild an engine, but he taught you to love this machine. That's why you're here. As evening approached and Martha called them in for dinner, Alexander realized he had gone an entire day without thinking about the stock market, checking his email, or worrying about what his competitors were doing. For a man whose life had been defined by constant vigilance and immediate response to every market fluctuation, this should have felt irresponsible. Instead, it felt like freedom over dinner pot roast that Martha had been cooking slowly all day, vegetables from their own garden, and bread still warm from the oven. Alexander listened to the Fisher family discuss their day with the easy intimacy of people who genuinely enjoyed each other's company. No one checked phones or rushed through the meal to get to more important activities. The food was the activity, along with the conversation and the simple pleasure of being together. "Mr. Stratton," said Rebecca, the middle child at 10 years. "Old. Do you have children?" "I have a son," Alexander replied. "He's grown up now, lives in California. Do you miss him?" The question, asked with such innocent directness, hit Alexander like a physical blow. "Yes," he said quietly. "Yes, I do miss him very much. Why don't you visit him?" From the mouths of babes. Alexander looked around the table at this family who had welcomed a stranger into their home, who worked together and ate together and seemed to find joy in the simple rhythms of daily life. When had he last felt that kind of connection with James? When had they last had a conversation that wasn't shadowed by years of accumulated disappointments and misunderstandings? "It's complicated," he said finally. Josiah met his eyes across the table. "Most important things are. That's why they're important." That night, lying in the simple guest room with moonlight streaming through hand-sewn curtains, Alexander thought about phone calls he could make, conversations he could start, if he could find the courage to be as honest with his son as these strangers had been with him. Outside his window, the rural night was full of sounds he was only beginning to recognize. The distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of wind through corn, the soft hoot of an owl hunting in the darkness. It was a different kind of music than the urban symphony of sirens and traffic he was used to, but somehow more peaceful. Tomorrow, Josiah had promised, they would begin putting the Jaguar back together. But for the first time since arriving in Pennsylvania, Alexander found himself wondering if the car was the only thing that needed healing. The third morning brought with it the rhythms Alexander was beginning to anticipate. The rooster's crow before dawn, the gentle bustle of the Fisher family beginning their day, and the smell of Martha's fresh-baked bread drifting up from the kitchen. But today there was something different in the air, a sense of anticipation that seemed to emanate from the barn where the Jaguar waited. Alexander found Josiah already at work, carefully cleaning components in a solution that smelled of kerosene and determination. The craftsman had laid out what looked like half the car's engine on clean cloths, each part positioned with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. "Today we begin the real work," Josiah said without looking up from the carburetor he was meticulously disassembling. Yesterday was about understanding. Today is about healing. Alexander poured himself coffee from the thermos Martha had sent out and settled onto a wooden stool to watch. Over the past few days, he had come to appreciate the meditative quality of Josiah's work, the careful attention to detail, the respect for each component no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Alexander said, "about the car fighting itself because of all the different repairs over the years." Josiah glanced up, his hands never pausing in their methodical work. "And it reminds me of my business. Every time we had a problem, we'd hire consultants or buy new technology or restructure departments. Each solution made sense individually. But after a while, the whole company started feeling, I don't know, disjointed. Like it had forgotten what it was originally supposed to do. What was it originally supposed to do?" Alexander had to think about that. Stratton Industries had been founded by his grandfather as a small construction company, building homes for working families in Queens. Over 3 generations, it had grown into a multinational corporation with interests in real estate development, manufacturing, and financial services. "Build things that lasted," he said finally. "My grandfather believed in creating value that would outlive him. And now? Now we create profit that lasts until the next quarterly report." Josiah nodded slowly, his attention returning to the carburetor. "Sometimes the most important repair is remembering what something was meant to be before you start fixing what it's become." They worked in companionable silence for an hour, Alexander learning to anticipate which tool Josiah would need next, developing an appreciation for the craftsman's economy of movement. Every gesture had purpose. Nothing was wasted. Around mid-morning, Martha appeared with her recipe book, a leather-bound volume that looked older than the barn itself. She settled at a workbench with a pencil and began making notes, occasionally glancing up to watch their progress. Planning tomorrow's meals? Alexander asked during a break. Planning next week's canning, Martha replied. The tomatoes will be ready soon, and preserving them properly takes timing. Too early and they won't have enough flavor. Too late and they'll be past their prime. How do you know when the timing is exactly right? Martha smiled. Same way Josiah knows when a piece of wood is ready to be shaped, or when your car is ready to run again. You learn to listen to what things are telling you instead of deciding what you think they should be telling you. Alexander found himself studying the recipe book with growing fascination. The pages were filled with handwritten notes in different inks and hands Martha's careful script, but also entries that looked much older. This belonged to my mother-in-law, Martha explained, noticing his interest, and her mother before that. Some of these recipes go back 4 generations. Each woman who used this book added her own discoveries, what worked better, what didn't work at all, improvements based on experience. Like technical documentation that gets better over time instead of becoming obsolete, Alexander mused. Exactly. The wisdom accumulates instead of being discarded every few years in favor of something newer. As Martha spoke, Alexander thought about his own industry's obsession with innovation for its own sake. How many proven methods had his company abandoned in favor of trendy new approaches that promised revolutionary results but delivered marginal improvements at best? May I look? He asked, gesturing toward the recipe book. Martha nodded, moving to sit beside him as she turned the pages. Each recipe was a small story, not just ingredients and measurements, but notes about occasions when the dish had been served, adjustments made for different seasons or available ingredients, even comments about which children preferred which variations. This apple pie recipe, Martha said, pointing to a page covered with multiple handwritings, started with my husband's great-grandmother. But look how it's evolved. She traced the margin notes with her finger. Less sugar when apples are particularly sweet. Extra cinnamon during cold winters. A different crust technique discovered by accident when someone misread the original instructions but got better results. It's like a conversation between generations, Alexander said. That's exactly what it is. Each cook learns from the ones before and teaches the ones who come after. Nothing gets lost, but everything gets better. Alexander thought about his own family's legacy, the impressive buildings and financial achievements that bore the Stratton name, but also the growing distance between generations, the loss of whatever wisdom his grandfather might have accumulated during his years of building homes for working families. I don't think I have anything like this to pass down to my son, he said quietly. Martha closed the book gently. You have the Jaguar, and you have the stories that go with it. If I can get it running again, the car will run, Martha said with quiet confidence. But that's not really what you're trying to fix, is it? Before Alexander could respond, the sound of automobile engines broke the rural quiet. Through the barn door, they could see 2 black SUVs turning into the driveway, their tinted windows and aggressive styling looking as out of place in this pastoral setting as spacecraft. Alexander's stomach tightened. He recognized those vehicles. His business partner, Richard, always traveled in similar convoys when he wanted to make an impression. The fact that Richard had tracked them down here meant either exceptional good news or exceptional bad news, and Alexander's experience suggested the latter was more likely. The lead SUV stopped near the barn, and Richard Blackwood emerged like a general surveying a battlefield. At 55, Richard was everything Alexander had once aspired to be: ruthlessly efficient, utterly focused on results, and completely unencumbered by sentimental attachments. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people. Made in a month, and his expression suggested he considered this entire pastoral scene a temporary aberration that needed to be corrected immediately. Alexander, Richard said, his voice carrying the tone of a parent who had finally located a missing child. We need to talk." Josiah and Martha exchanged glances but continued with their work, as if billionaires in expensive suits arrived at their farm every day. Alexander envied their calm. "Richard," Alexander replied, stepping outside the barn. "This is unexpected, is it? You disappear for 3 days without explanation, miss 2 board meetings, and ignore approximately 47 phone calls. The Henderson merger is falling apart. The Tokyo investors are threatening to pull out, and our stock price is down 8% because the market thinks you've had some kind of breakdown." "Have I?" The question seemed to catch Richard off guard. "Have you what?" "Had a breakdown. Is that what it looks like when someone steps away from the office for a few days to handle a personal matter?" Richard's eyes swept over the farm buildings, the grazing cattle, the Amish family working quietly in the barn. "Personal matter? Alexander, you're one of the most powerful businessmen in the country, and you're playing with car parts in a barn. Yes, that looks like a breakdown. Or it looks like someone finally taking time to fix something that matters to him. The company matters. Your investors matter. Your responsibilities matter." Richard's voice was rising, though he was clearly trying to maintain control. "This," he gestured broadly at the farm, "this is not who you are." Alexander looked back at the barn, where Josiah was patiently explaining something to Martha while they worked together on the Jaguar's restored components. 3 days ago, he would have agreed with Richard completely. The farm, the simple life, the focus on craftsmanship over profit, none of it aligned with the identity he had spent decades constructing. But standing here in the morning sun, breathing air that smelled of hay and growing things instead of exhaust fumes and stress, Alexander found himself wondering if Richard might be wrong. Maybe this wasn't who he was, but maybe it was who he could become. "Give me until the weekend," Alexander said. 4 more days. Then we can discuss whatever crisis needs my immediate attention. Alexander, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. For the first time in years, I'm being completely reasonable. Alexander turned back toward the barn. Now, he had just made the first truly independent decision of his adult life. The knowledge both terrified and exhilarated him. "Friends of yours?" Josiah asked mildly when Alexander returned to the barn. "Business partners. Former friends, possibly." "Ah." Josiah returned his attention to the carburetor. "Sometimes fixing. One thing means breaking something else first. The question is whether what you're building is worth more than what you're tearing down." Alexander picked up a clean rag and began polishing a chrome component that Josiah had finished rebuilding. Outside, he could hear the Fisher children playing in the yard, their laughter mixing with the distant sound of cattle and the rustle of wind through growing corn. For the first time in his life, Alexander thought he might know the answer to Josiah's question. The confrontation with Richard left Alexander unsettled in ways he hadn't expected. As he tried to focus on helping Josiah reassemble the Jaguar's electrical system, his mind kept drifting to the stack of business cards in his wallet dozens, of connections that had once seemed vitally important but now felt like obligations to a life he wasn't sure he wanted to return to. "You're thinking too hard," Josiah observed as Alexander fumbled with a simple wire connection for the 3rd time. When the mind is elsewhere, the hands forget what they know. Alexander set down the electrical component and rubbed his temples. "Sorry, I keep thinking about what my partner said, about responsibilities and who I'm supposed to be." "And who are you supposed to be?" It was such a simple question, but Alexander realized he had no simple answer. For decades, his identity had been defined by external expectations, what shareholders wanted, what business publications wrote about him, what success looked like in the circles where he moved. "I don't know anymore," he admitted. "For most of my life, I thought being successful meant being indispensable. Now I'm starting to wonder if being indispensable means I've never learned to just be myself." Josiah nodded thoughtfully. My father used to say that a man who's afraid to step away from his work for a few days probably isn't doing work worth stepping back to. They worked in silence for a while, the familiar rhythm of collaborative effort helping to settle Alexander's mind. The Jaguar was beginning to look like itself. Again, components that had been scattered across the workbench were finding their way back to their proper places. Each connection made with the careful attention that Josiah brought to everything. He touched Dot around noon. Daniel, Josiah's 14-year-old son, appeared in the barn doorway with obvious excitement, barely contained behind his usually serious expression. "Papa," he said, would it be all right if I helped with the car today?" Josiah glanced up from the carburetor he was adjusting. "If Mr. Stratton doesn't mind another pair of hands." "I'd welcome the help," Alexander said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. Over the past few days, he had come to appreciate Daniel's quiet intelligence and careful way of approaching problems. As the three of them worked together, Alexander found himself thinking about his own son James at that age. James had shown interest in the Jaguar then, asking questions about how the engine worked and begging to help with simple maintenance tasks. But Alexander had always been too busy, too worried about James getting hurt or making expensive mistakes, too focused on the urgent demands of business to appreciate the gift of his son's curiosity. "Daniel," Alexander said as the boy carefully cleaned a set of spark plugs, "what do you want to do when you grow up?" The question seemed to surprise the teenager. "I haven't decided yet. Papa says I should learn as many skills as possible while I'm young, so I'll have choices when I'm older." "What kinds of skills interest you?" "I like working with my hands, furniture making, metalwork, mechanics. But I also like learning about how things work. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to study engineering or design." Alexander felt a pang of recognition. That curiosity, that desire to understand how things worked, it was exactly what he had seen in James's eyes all those years ago, before life and expectations and fear of failure had dulled that bright interest. "Those interests don't have to be separate," Alexander said carefully. "Some of the best engineers I know started by working with their hands first." "Really?" Daniel's eyes lit up with genuine interest. "Really. Understanding how things work in practice makes you better at designing them in theory." Josiah had been listening to this exchange while fine-tuning the carburetor mixture. "Mr. Stratton is right," he said. "Knowledge that comes through the hands stays with you differently than knowledge that only lives in books." As the afternoon progressed, Alexander found himself sharing stories about his early days in business, not the sanitized versions he usually told at corporate events, but real stories about mistakes and failures and the slow process of learning what actually mattered. Daniel listened with the same attention he brought to mechanical work, asking thoughtful questions that reminded Alexander of conversations he wished he'd had with his own son. "Did you always know you wanted to run a big company?" Daniel asked, as they worked on rewiring the dashboard lighting. "Actually, no," Alexander admitted. "When I was your age, I wanted to be an architect. I loved the idea of designing buildings that would last for generations. What changed? My father died, and I inherited his business. It seemed like the responsible thing to do was to keep it going and make it bigger." Alexander paused, thinking about paths not taken. "But sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd followed my original dream instead of feeling obligated to follow his." "It's not too late," Daniel said with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes possess. "Papa always says you can change direction at any point in your life, as long as you're willing to accept that the new path might look different than what you originally planned." The words hit Alexander with unexpected force. Not too late. He was 62 years old, wealthy beyond measure, with responsibilities that affected thousands of employees and shareholders. The idea that he could still change direction seemed both impossible and intensely appealing. That evening, as the Fisher family gathered for dinner, Alexander made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "I'd like to call my son," he announced as Martha served pot roast that had been cooking slowly all day. "Would it be possible to use your phone?" "Of course," Martha said. "The phone is in the kitchen whenever you need it." After dinner, Alexander stood in the Fishers' simple kitchen, staring at their old rotary phone, a device he hadn't used in decades. The number for James's apartment in San Francisco was programmed into his cell phone, but he had memorized it years ago and was relieved to discover his memory hadn't failed him. The phone rang 4 times before James answered, his voice cautious, as he read the unfamiliar number on his caller ID. "Hello? James, it's your father." A pause. "Dad? Whose number is this? Are you all right?" "I'm fine. This is going to sound strange. I'm calling from an Amish farm in Pennsylvania." "A what now?" Alexander took a deep breath and began to explain about the broken Jaguar, about his desperate search for someone who could repair it, about finding Josiah and staying with his family while the car was being restored. As he spoke, he could hear the surprise and confusion in James's voice gradually giving way to something that sounded almost like interest. "So you're actually staying on a farm? You, who haven't taken a vacation in 15 years. I know it sounds crazy. Actually, it sounds, I don't know, different. Good different, maybe." James paused. "How's the car coming along?" "Better than I hoped. Josiah thinks he can have it running within a few days." "James, I was wondering, would you consider flying out here? I know it's short notice, but I'd like you to see this place. And I'd like you to be here when we try to start the car again." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Alexander began to worry the connection had been lost. Finally, James spoke. "Why?" "Because the car belongs to both of us now. Because it represents something I want to share with you instead of keeping to myself. And because," Alexander struggled to find the right words, "because I've learned some things here that I should have learned a long time ago, and I'd like to try sharing them with you if you're willing to listen." Another pause. "I can probably get a flight tomorrow evening." "But Dad, this isn't some kind of business thing, is it? You're not trying to get me to come back to work for the company?" "No business," Alexander promised. "Just a father and son and a car that means more to both of us than either of us probably realized." "All right," James said, and Alexander could hear something in his son's voice that he hadn't heard in years, curiosity mixed with cautious hope. "I'll see you tomorrow." As Alexander hung up the phone, he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was more excited about a personal reunion than he was worried about what he was missing at the office. The feeling both terrified and exhilarated him, like standing at the edge of a cliff and discovering he might actually know how to fly Dot in the barn. The Jaguar waited patiently for its final repairs, its engine nearly ready to purr back to life. But Alexander knew now that the car had never been the only thing in need of healing. Some repairs, he was learning, took more than mechanical skill. They took courage, honesty, and the willingness to admit that being broken wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of the real work. The letter changed everything. Josiah found it while cleaning out the Jaguar's glove compartment, preparing to reinstall the dashboard components that had been painstakingly restored over the past week. It was tucked behind the owner's manual, in a manila envelope that had been sealed with tape that had yellowed and dried over the years, but still held firmly enough to suggest that whatever was inside had been meant to stay hidden until the right moment. "Mr. Stratton," Josiah called from inside the car, his voice carrying an unusual note of gravity. "I think you should see this." Alexander looked up from the engine bay, where he had been helping Daniel install the rebuilt alternator. Over the past few days, working alongside Josiah's son had become one of the unexpected pleasures of this strange interlude. The boy had the same patient approach to mechanical problems as his father, but with a young person's eagerness to understand not just how things worked, but why they were designed that way. What is it? Alexander asked, wiping his hands on a rag as he approached the car. Josiah emerged from the driver's seat, holding the envelope carefully, as if it might contain something fragile. It was sealed and hidden behind the manual. The writing on the outside says, "For Alexander, when the time is right." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the handwriting immediately, his father's careful script, the same precise lettering that had appeared on birthday cards and Christmas gifts throughout his childhood. But his father had been dead for 15 years. How could there be a letter he had never seen? With trembling fingers, Alexander took the envelope and examined it more closely. The paper was high-quality stationery, the kind his father had always used for important correspondence. The tape sealing it was old, but intact, suggesting it had been placed in the glove compartment years ago and forgotten, or deliberately hidden until someone had reason to clean out that particular space. Should I? Alexander looked at Josiah uncertainly. "That's between you and your father," Josiah said gently. "Daniel and I will give you some privacy." They moved to the other side of the barn, busying themselves with organizing tools while Alexander stood alone beside the car that had brought him to this moment. His hand shook slightly as he carefully peeled away the old tape and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in his father's familiar handwriting, along with a small black and white photograph. Alexander recognized the photo immediately. It showed his father as a young man, probably in his early 30s, standing beside the newly purchased Jaguar, with a smile that looked genuinely happy rather than merely successful. The letter was dated just 3 months before his father's death, a time when Alexander had been traveling constantly for business, too busy with deals and mergers to visit home as often as he probably should have. "My dear son, if you're reading this, it probably means the old Jaguar has finally broken down beyond my ability to fix it. I've hidden this letter here because I know that when that day comes, you'll move heaven and earth to restore this car, even if it seems impossible. It's not really about the car. Of course, it never was. It's about us and the conversations we never had, and the time we lost to things that seemed important but weren't. I'm writing this after another sleepless night, thinking about all the Sunday drives we used to take when you were young. Those drives were the best part of my week. The only time I felt like I was being the father I wanted to be instead of the businessman I felt I had to be. But somewhere along the way, I let the business take over everything else. I told myself I was building something for you, creating a legacy that would give you opportunities I never had. What I was really doing was repeating my own father's mistakes. My father built this company through sheer determination and sacrifice, working 16-hour days and missing most of my childhood. I swore I would be different, but when you were growing up, I found myself working just as hard, missing just as many school plays and ball games and ordinary Tuesday dinners. I told myself it was temporary, that once the business was more stable, I would have time to be the father I wanted to be. The truth is, there's always another deal, another crisis, another opportunity that seems too important to ignore. I kept thinking I would slow down next year, spend more time with you and your mother, take those long drives we both loved so much. But next year never came. Your mother died before I could make good on any of my promises to travel with her, to take that trip to Europe she always wanted. And you grew up before I could figure out how to balance being your father with being the head of a company. I see you making the same choices now, and it breaks my heart. You're so focused on building something bigger and better than what I left. That you're missing the life happening right in front of you. James is growing up without really knowing his grandfather or his father. The business will survive if you take a vacation or miss a meeting. But childhood only happens once. This car has been my most treasured possession for 30 years. Not because it's valuable or beautiful, though it is both, but because it represents The best moments of my life as a father. Every Sunday drive, every time we worked on it together in the garage, every conversation we had while the miles rolled beneath our wheels. Those memories are worth more than all the companies and buildings and investments I'll leave behind. I hope that when this car breaks down, you'll take the time to really fix it, not just hire someone else to handle the problem, but actually work on it yourself with your hands and your patience and your attention. I hope you'll discover what I learned too late, that the most important things in life can't be delegated or purchased or postponed until a more convenient time. And I hope you'll call James. Whatever anger or disappointment exists between you, life is too short and too uncertain to waste time on pride. The boy loves you, even if he doesn't know how to show it anymore. Be the father to him that I should have been to you, present, patient, and willing to put the relationship ahead of everything else. The glove compartment also contains the original keys I received when I bought this car in 1955. I want you to have them, along with all the memories they represent. But more than that, I want you to use this car the way it was meant to be used for Sunday drives with people you love, for teaching your son how things work, for taking time to appreciate the journey instead of rushing toward the next destination. I love you, son. I always have, even when I wasn't very good at showing it. Don't make my mistakes. Don't wait until it's too late to be the man your family needs you to be. Your father, William Stratton, P.S. The car's real problem has always been that it was built for leisurely drives, not business emergencies. Treat it gently, and it will run forever. Treat it like just another tool, and it will eventually stop cooperating. People work the same way. Alexander read the letter twice, then a third time each, past revealing new layers of meaning and regret. His father's words painted a picture of a man who had recognized his mistakes but run out of time to correct them. A man who had chosen business success over personal fulfillment and spent his final months watching his son repeat the same destructive patterns. The photograph showed his father at an age when everything still seemed possible, when the weight of responsibility and expectation hadn't yet bent his shoulders or lined his face. Alexander tried to remember when he had last felt that kind of uncomplicated joy, that sense of being exactly where he belonged. The glove compartment yielded one more treasure, a set of keys so worn and polished that they seemed to glow in the barn's afternoon light. These were the original keys, the ones his father had carried for 30 years, worn smooth by decades of Sunday drives and quiet moments of mechanical communion. Alexander looked up to find Josiah and Daniel watching him from across the barn, their faces full of gentle concern. "Everything all right?" Josiah asked. "My father," Alexander's voice caught. He knew I was making the same mistakes he did, and he tried to warn me before he died. But I was too busy to listen. Josiah approached slowly, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. Sometimes the most important messages take years to reach us. The timing has to be right. But what if it's too late? What if I've already lost too much time? Is your son still alive? Yes. Are you still alive? Yes. Then it's not too late. It's just late enough that you finally understand what needs to be fixed. Alexander looked down at the letter again, his father's words blurring slightly as emotion made his eyes water. All these years, he had been trying to honor his father's memory by building bigger and better versions of what the old man had created. But what his father had actually wanted was for Alexander to learn from his mistakes, not repeat them. The sound of a car engine broke the afternoon silence. Through the barn door, Alexander could see a taxi pulling into the driveway, and his heart leaped as he recognized the passenger climbing out with a small duffel bag. James had come. Alexander folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his shirt pocket next to his heart. In a few minutes, he would share his father's words with his son, and together they would try to start the conversation that should have begun years ago. But first, he wanted to savor this moment standing in a simple barn with a broken car that was finally ready to run again, holding keys that represented 3 generations of Sunday drives and missed opportunities and the chance to finally get things right. The Jaguar sat gleaming in the afternoon light, its engine rebuilt with patience and understanding rather than money and hurry. Like the relationship Alexander hoped to rebuild with his son, it would require ongoing care and attention. But for the first time in years, Alexander felt ready to provide both. His father had been right about one thing: the most important repairs couldn't be delegated. They had to be done by hand, with love, and with the willingness to take as much time as the healing required. James looked exactly like Alexander, had at 35 tall and lean with intelligent eyes that missed little, though his brown hair was longer than Alexander would have chosen, and his casual clothes spoke of someone who had deliberately rejected the business world's dress codes. Standing in the Fisher family's driveway with his leather messenger bag slung over one shoulder, he looked around the farm with an expression that mixed curiosity with skepticism. "So this is where you've been hiding," James said as Alexander approached. There was no hostility in his voice, but there was a wariness that spoke of years of careful distance between them. "Not hiding," Alexander replied. "Learning things I should have figured out a long time ago." They stood for a moment in awkward silence. 2 men who shared blood and history, but had somehow forgotten how to simply be father and son. Alexander found himself wanting to embrace James, but uncertain whether such a gesture would be welcomed or endured out of politeness. Josiah emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, and the moment of uncertainty passed. "You must be James," Josiah said, extending his hand with the same warm directness he had shown Alexander a week ago. "I'm Josiah Fisher. Your father has told us a great deal about you." James shook the offered hand, and Alexander was pleased to see genuine interest in his son's face, rather than the polite mask he usually wore when meeting new people. "Thank you for helping with the car," James said. "That Jaguar has been breaking down and getting repaired for as long as I can remember. I'm honestly surprised anyone was able to fix it." "Oh, we're not quite finished yet," Josiah replied. "But your timing is perfect. We should be ready for the first startup attempt tomorrow morning. Your father thought you might want to be here for that." "Actually, yes," James said, and Alexander heard something in his son's voice that he hadn't heard in years: genuine enthusiasm. "I have a lot of good memories connected to that car." Martha appeared on the front porch and waved them toward the house. "Dinner's ready, and there's someone I'd like James to meet." Over a meal of chicken and dumplings that somehow managed to be both simple and exceptional, James was introduced to the Fisher children and drawn into the kind of easy conversation that Alexander had come to treasure during his week on the farm. Daniel, in particular, seemed fascinated by James's work as a software engineer, asking thoughtful questions about the intersection of technology and problem solving. "It's not so different from what your father does," James explained as he described the process of debugging complex code. "You have to understand the whole system before you can figure out why one part isn't working properly." "That's exactly what Papa said about your grandfather's car," Hannah chimed in. "He said all the parts were fighting each other because nobody understood what the whole car was trying to do." Alexander watched this exchange with a mixture of pride and regret. James was a natural teacher patient, clear in his explanations, genuinely interested in sharing knowledge. When had Alexander last seen this side of his son? When had they last had a conversation where James lit up with enthusiasm instead of maintaining the careful politeness that characterized most of their interactions? After dinner, as the Fisher family settled into their evening routines, Alexander and James walked out to the barn to see the restored Jaguar. In the soft light of kerosene lanterns, Josiah preferred them to electric lighting for detail work. The car looked like something from a dream. Every chrome surface polished to mirror brightness, the British racing green paint gleaming with depth that seemed to go on forever. "Wow," James said quietly, running his hand along the car's flank. "It looks better than I remember it ever looking." Josiah says that sometimes you have to strip something down to its essence before you can build it back up properly, Alexander said. I think he was talking about more than just the car. James glanced at his father, something shifting in his expression. "Dad, what's really going on here? This isn't like you, taking time off, staying on a farm, working with your hands instead of hiring someone else to handle the problems." Alexander reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew the letter, now slightly creased from being carried, close to his heart for the past day. "Your grandfather left us something. I found it yesterday, hidden in the glove compartment." He handed the letter to James, who unfolded it carefully and began to read by the warm light of the lanterns. Alexander watched his son's face as he processed their father's words, seeing surprise give way to understanding and then to something that looked like grief. "He knew," James said finally. "Grandpa knew exactly what was happening, and he tried to warn you. And I was too busy building the business to listen. Just like you've been trying to tell me things for years, and I've been too focused on what I thought was important to really hear you." James folded the letter carefully and handed it back to his father. "You know what the hardest part is? I can see myself starting to make the same mistakes. I work 60-hour weeks. I haven't taken a real vacation in 3 years. And I keep telling myself it's just temporary, that once this project is finished or that promotion comes through, I'll have time for the things that actually matter. What things? I don't know. That's the problem. I've been so focused on building my career that I've forgotten what I was building it for." James leaned against the car's fender, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd followed your original dream? If you'd become an architect instead of taking over the company?" Alexander considered the question seriously. "Every day, lately. But I'm starting to think the real question isn't what would have happened if I'd made different choices then. It's what could still happen if I make better choices now." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe it's not too late to remember what actually matters. Maybe the business can survive without me micromanaging every decision. Maybe I can find ways to build things that last longer than quarterly earnings reports." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, both of them lost in thought. The rural evening was full of sounds Alexander had learned to appreciate: cattle lowing in distant fields, the rustle of wind through corn, the gentle murmur of the Fisher family's voices from the house. "Dad," James said eventually, "there's something I need to tell you. I've been thinking about leaving my job." Alexander felt his heart quicken, but he forced himself to simply listen instead of immediately offering advice or solutions. "It's a good job," James continued. "Good money, good benefits, advancement opportunities. But I wake up every morning, dreading the day ahead. I'm solving problems I don't care about for people who see me as replaceable. And I keep thinking about what Grandpa wrote in that letter, about not waiting until it's too late to be the person your family needs you to be. What would you do instead? I don't know yet. Maybe teach. Maybe start my own company. Maybe something I haven't even thought of yet." James looked at his father uncertainly. "I know it sounds irresponsible. It sounds like courage," Alexander interrupted. "It sounds like you're willing to risk security for the chance to find meaning." "That's not irresponsible. That's exactly what your grandfather wished he'd been brave enough to do." The conversation was interrupted by Josiah emerging from the house, carrying a small wooden box that Alexander hadn't seen before. "Sorry to interrupt," Josiah said, "but I wanted to show you both something before tomorrow's big moment." He opened the box to reveal a set of hand-forged tools, wrenches and screwdrivers and specialty implements that looked like they belonged in a museum, rather than a working garage. "These belonged to my great-grandfather," Josiah explained. He was a blacksmith who transitioned to working on automobiles when horses started giving way to motors. Every tool in this box was made by hand for a specific purpose. He lifted out a wrench that had been worn smooth by decades of use. This one was designed specifically for adjusting the blind carburetors on Model T Fords. It wouldn't work for any other application, but for that one job, it's perfect. Alexander and James examined the tools with growing fascination. Each implement told a story of craftsmanship and purpose, of work that was valued for its quality rather than its speed. The reason I'm showing you this, Josiah continued, is because tomorrow, when we start your car for the first time, I want to use these tools for the final adjustments, not because they're necessary. I have modern tools that would work just as well, but because some moments deserve to be marked with ceremony, with acknowledgement of the generations that came before and the ones that will come after. He closed the box carefully and looked at both Alexander and James. Your automobile isn't just a machine. It's a bridge between your past and your future, between the father you lost and the son you still have time to know better. When we bring it back to life tomorrow, we'll be completing a circle that began long before any of us were born. As they walked back to the house together, Alexander felt a sense of anticipation building in his chest that had nothing to do with business deals or investment opportunities. Tomorrow, they would discover whether months of patient work had been successful. But more importantly, he and James would share a moment that neither deadlines nor meetings could interrupt. A moment of pure possibility, unmarked by the accumulated disappointments and misunderstandings of the past. That night, lying in the simple guest room with his son sleeping in Daniel's room across the hall, Alexander thought about the community petition that Martha had shown him earlier. A development company was trying to force Josiah to sell his land for a shopping complex, threatening to use eminent domain if he refused. The irony wasn't lost on Alexander. His own company had participated in similar projects over the years, viewing small holdouts as obstacles to progress rather than as communities worth preserving. But now, having experienced the peace and purpose that seemed to emanate from this place, Alexander found himself thinking about different kinds of development, projects that enhanced communities rather than replacing them, buildings that served generations rather than just shareholders. As sleep finally claimed him, Alexander's last conscious thought was about the morning ahead, about the sound he hoped to hear when Josiah turned the key in the Jaguar's ignition, and about the conversation he and James would have during their first Sunday drive in more than a decade. Some things he was learning were worth waiting for, and some repairs were worth whatever time they required to get them right. The morning arrived with the kind of clarity that seemed to promise significant events. Alexander woke before dawn to find frost coating the farmhouse, windows and the first hints of autumn color touching the maple trees that bordered the Fisher property. The air held that crisp quality that made every breath feel purposeful. In the kitchen, Martha was already preparing breakfast, moving efficiently around her domain while coffee percolated on the stove. The smell of bacon and fresh biscuits filled the air, along with an undercurrent of anticipation that seemed to affect everyone in the house. "Big day," Martha said simply as Alexander poured himself coffee from the ceramic pot she always kept ready. "Yes," Alexander replied, though he found himself thinking less about the car and more about the phone call he planned to make after breakfast. A call that would either save Josiah's workshop or force Alexander to confront how much he was really willing to sacrifice for his newfound principles. James appeared in the doorway, his hair still rumpled from sleep, but his eyes bright with curiosity. "Any word from the barn yet?" "Josiah's been out there since before sunrise," Martha replied, "making final adjustments, checking everything one more time. He wants to be absolutely certain before we attempt the first start." They ate breakfast with the subdued conversation of people preparing for something momentous. Even the Fisher children seemed to sense the importance of the day. speaking in lower voices than usual and stealing glances toward the barn where their father was performing his final preparations. After breakfast, the entire family processed toward the barn like pilgrims approaching a shrine. Alexander carried his father's letter in his shirt pocket and the original car keys in his hand, their familiar weight somehow comforting. James walked beside him, occasionally reaching out to touch his father's arm in a gesture of solidarity. That meant more than any words could have expressed. Inside the barn, they found Josiah making delicate adjustments to the carburetor using his great-grandfather's hand-forged tools. The Jaguar sat in a shaft of morning sunlight that seemed to make the British racing green paint glow from within. Every surface had been cleaned and polished to perfection, every component restored or rebuilt with the kind of attention that bordered on reverence. "She's ready," Josiah announced, straightening from his work. "All systems checked, all connections verified. The rest is up to her." Alexander approached the car slowly, almost afraid that moving too quickly might break the spell. He had dreamed of this moment for months, but now that it was here, he found himself surprisingly calm. Whatever happened next, the journey had been worth taking. "Would you like to do the honors?" Josiah asked, gesturing toward the driver's seat. Alexander shook his head. "You've done all the work. You should be the one to wake her up." But Josiah stepped back with a gentle smile. "This isn't about mechanical work, Mr. Stratton. This is about relationships. The car needs to hear a familiar voice telling her it's time to run again." The entire Fisher family had gathered around the car now, their faces reflecting the kind of quiet excitement that accompanies truly meaningful moments. Alexander looked at James, who nodded encouragingly, then at Martha, whose expression reminded him of someone witnessing a marriage ceremony. Alexander climbed behind the wheel for the first time in months. The leather seat embraced him like an old friend, and his hands found their familiar positions on the steering wheel and gear shift. Everything was exactly as he remembered, but somehow better, cleaner, more purposeful. Restored to its original intention, he inserted the worn key into the ignition and paused, thinking about his father's letter and the generations of Sunday drives that had started with this same simple action. Then, with a prayer that was half hope and half gratitude, he turned the key. The starter motor engaged with a strong, confident whir. The engine turned over once, twice, and on the third revolution, it caught with a sound that was nothing short of musical. A deep, throaty purr filled the barn, speaking of precision engineering and patient restoration. The Jaguar's engine settled into a smooth idle that was somehow both powerful and gentle, like a large cat that had awakened from a long nap and was pleased to discover it was still magnificently alive. Alexander felt tears spring to his eyes as the vibration of the running engine traveled through the steering wheel and into his hands. It was exactly the feeling he remembered from childhood, the sense of connection to something larger than himself, something that represented the best of human craftsmanship and care. "Listen to that," James whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "It sounds exactly like I remember." For a moment, the barn was filled with nothing but the steady rhythm of the restored engine and the quiet satisfaction of people who had witnessed something truly remarkable. Alexander let the car idle, listening to every note of its mechanical symphony, checking gauges that now showed proper oil pressure and charging voltage for the first time in months. Then he looked up at Josiah, whose weathered face wore an expression of quiet pride mixed with something deeper, the satisfaction that came from work done properly, with patience and understanding rather than haste and force. "Thank you," Alexander said, though the words seemed inadequate for what had just been accomplished. "Thank you for giving me back something I thought was lost forever." "Nothing was lost," Josiah replied simply. "It was just waiting for the right kind of attention." The negotiation took place on the Fisher family's front porch, with the restored Jaguar purring softly in the background like a mechanical heartbeat. Alexander had asked Josiah to keep the engine running, partly to ensure the repairs were holding up under continuous operation, but mostly because the sound reminded him of what was truly at stake. Harrison sat across from Alexander at Martha's kitchen table, which had been moved outside for the occasion. Between them lay the legal documents that could either save or destroy everything the Fisher family had built over 3 generations. James stood nearby with his phone, documenting everything as Alexander had requested, while the Fisher family watched from a respectful distance. "Let me see if I understand your proposal correctly," Harrison said, consulting his notes. "You're offering to provide Pinnacle Development with preferential access to 3 prime commercial properties in Manhattan, worth approximately $50 million in potential development value in exchange for abandoning this eminent domain action." "That's correct," Alexander replied. "The properties are currently under long-term leases that expire within the next 18 months. When they do, Pinnacle would have first right of refusal on development deals that would generate significantly more revenue than a rural shopping complex, and you would guarantee financing for these projects through Stratton Industries. Yes, we would be equal partners in all 3 developments, sharing both the investment costs and the profits." Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting the kind of careful calculation that Alexander recognized from thousands of similar negotiations. But this time, Alexander found himself hoping the other party would accept the deal rather than trying to find ways to maximize his own advantage. "It's an attractive offer," Harrison said finally, "but I'll need to run the numbers with my board of directors. These kinds of decisions can't be made in the field." "I understand. But I should mention that this offer has a time limit." "How long?" Alexander glanced at his watch. "About 15 minutes. Long enough for you to make a phone call and get authorization, but not long enough for competing developers to hear about the opportunity and start making counteroffers." It was a classic pressure tactic, one Alexander had used hundreds of times to force quick decisions on deals that might fall apart under extended scrutiny. But this time, instead of using urgency to gain advantage, he was using it to protect something he cared about. Harrison made the call from his SUV, speaking in urgent whispers to someone on the other end, while his surveying crew waited in obvious confusion. Alexander used the time to check on the Jaguar, running his hands over the warm engine block and listening to the steady rhythm that Josiah's patient work had restored. 30 years I've been trying to fix this car myself," Alexander said to James as they stood together beside the running vehicle. "Hiring experts, buying expensive parts, throwing money at every problem. It never occurred to me that what it really needed was someone who understood how to listen to what it was trying to say." "It's not just about the car, is it?" James asked. "No, it's about everything. Business relationships, family relationships, the difference between fixing symptoms and healing causes." Alexander looked toward the porch where Josiah sat calmly waiting for the outcome of negotiations that would determine his family's future. "I've spent my whole career thinking that the fastest solution was always the best solution. These people have taught me that sometimes the best solution is the one that takes time to get right." Harrison returned from his phone call with the satisfied expression of someone who had just received very good news. "We have a deal," he announced. "My board is extremely interested in the Manhattan properties. We'll withdraw the eminent domain action immediately in exchange for the development partnership you've outlined." Alexander felt a wave of relief so profound that it nearly buckled his knees. Around him, the Fisher family maintained their characteristic composure, but he could see the gratitude in their eyes. "There's one more thing," Alexander said, producing a document he had prepared during the phone negotiations. "I'm establishing a foundation to support traditional craftspeople and sustainable farming practices. The foundation's first grant will be to help Mr. Fisher expand his workshop and begin training apprentices in traditional furniture making and mechanical restoration. Josiah looked up from the document Alexander handed him, his expression unreadable. "You don't need to do this, Mr. Stratton. Saving our land is more than enough. Actually, I do need to do this. For the past week, you and your family have given me something I didn't even know I was missing. A sense of purpose that goes beyond accumulating wealth. This foundation isn't charity. It's an investment in preserving knowledge and skills that our society desperately needs." As Harrison's convoy packed up their equipment and departed, Alexander realized that he had just conducted the most satisfying business negotiation of his entire career. For the first time, everyone involved had gotten what they truly needed, rather than just what they thought they wanted. The Jaguar continued to purr in the background, its restored engine providing a soundtrack of mechanical contentment. But the real restoration, Alexander knew, had nothing to do with carburetors and timing chains. It had to do with remembering what success actually looked like when measured in relationships instead of dollars, in sustainability instead of quarterly growth, in the legacy you left for future generations instead of the monuments you built to yourself. "So," James said as they watched the last of the development vehicles disappear down the gravel drive, "what happens now?" Alexander smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "Now we take our first Sunday drive in 15 years. And we start figuring out what we want to build together instead of what we think we're supposed to build separately." The sound of the Jaguar's engine seemed to approve of this plan, settling into an even steadier rhythm as if the car itself was eager to get back to its original purpose, carrying people who cared about each other to places where memories could be made and relationships could be healed. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the doorway of Josiah's expanded workshop, watching his son James and Daniel Fisher work together on restoring a 1962 Porsche 911 that belonged to a collector from Philadelphia. The barn had been doubled in size using traditional construction methods, creating space for both furniture making and automotive restoration while maintaining the timeless character that made this place special. The sight of the two young men, one Amish, one from Silicon Valley, collaborating on mechanical problems with the same patient methodology that Josiah had taught them both, never failed to make Alexander smile. They had become unlikely friends over the past months, bonding over their shared appreciation for work that required both technical knowledge and intuitive understanding. "Hand me that torque wrench," James said, his voice carrying the quiet confidence that came from truly knowing what he was doing. "The 15mm or the 12? Daniel asked, already reaching for the correct tool without waiting for an answer. Alexander marveled at the transformation in his son. James had left his corporate job 3 months ago and was now splitting his time between helping establish the Stratton Foundation for traditional crafts and learning restoration techniques from Josiah. The stress lines around his eyes had disappeared, replaced by the kind of contentment that came from work that felt meaningful. "Mr. Stratton," Martha called from the farmhouse porch, "your phone is ringing." Alexander had taken to leaving his cell phone in the house during workshop hours, checking messages only at prescribed times instead of allowing the constant ping of notifications to fragment his attention. It was a small change that had yielded enormous improvements in his ability to focus on whatever he was doing in the present moment. The call was from his assistant in New York, confirming the details for next week's board meeting where he would present his plan for transitioning Stratton Industries toward more sustainable and community-focused development practices. The change hadn't been easy. Some investors had balked at the shift away from maximum profit strategies, but the company's reputation and long-term prospects had actually improved as a result of their new approach. "Everything ready for the presentation?" Alexander asked. "Ready and rehearsed," his assistant replied. "The slides look great, and the financial projections for the sustainable development projects are even stronger than we initially estimated. I think the board is going to be very pleased." After hanging up, Alexander walked back toward the workshop, but stopped when he heard the familiar sound of the Jaguar's engine approaching on the country road. James appeared around the bend, the British racing green paint gleaming in the afternoon sun, with 3 passengers squeezed into the small interior. Alexander grinned as he recognized his cargo, Hannah and Rebecca Fisher in the back seat, both wearing the kind of expressions that children get when they're doing something slightly forbidden and absolutely delightful. James pulled into the driveway and climbed out, his hair windblown and his smile infectious. "How'd she run?" Alexander asked, running his hand along the car's warm hood. "Like a dream. We took the scenic route to Lancaster and back about 40 miles of country roads. The girls wanted to see what it felt like to ride in a fancy old car," James said, helping the Fisher children out of the back seat. "It's very bouncy," Hannah announced with the authority of an expert, "but in a good way, like riding a horse that knows where it's going." Alexander laughed, remembering his own first rides in this car when he was about Hannah's age. Some experiences, it seemed, transcended generations. Martha emerged from the house carrying a pitcher of lemonade and glasses, ritual that had developed over the months whenever the Jaguar returned from one of its increasingly frequent excursions. The car had become a kind of ambassador for the farm, carrying visitors and friends on tours of the countryside and serving as a bridge between the traditional Amish community and the wider world beyond. "Any problems with the restoration?" Josiah asked, emerging from the workshop with oil-stained hands and the satisfied expression of someone who had spent the day doing meaningful work. "None at all," James replied. "She purrs like she's happy to be alive again." As they sat on the front porch sharing lemonade and conversation, Alexander reflected on how much his life had changed since that desperate day when he first drove to this farm with a broken car and a broken sense of what mattered. The Jaguar had been restored to perfect mechanical condition, but the real transformation had been in the relationships that the car had helped to heal. The partnership agreement with Pinnacle Development had worked out exactly as Alexander had promised. The Manhattan properties had yielded profits that far exceeded what a rural shopping complex could have generated, while Josiah's farm remained a thriving center of traditional craftsmanship. The foundation Alexander had established was now supporting similar artisans across the country, helping to preserve knowledge and skills that might otherwise be lost to the relentless pace of technological change. But perhaps the most important change was sitting right beside him. James had found work that excited him instead of just paying him well, and their relationship had evolved from formal politeness to genuine friendship. They spoke on the phone several times a week, shared Sunday drives in the Jaguar whenever. Alexander visited Pennsylvania and had begun planning a cross-country trip for the following summer, just father and son and the open road, with no agenda beyond spending time together and seeing what they might discover along the way. "You know what I've been thinking?" James said, as the afternoon shadows grew longer and the rural quiet settled around them like a comfortable blanket. "What's that?" Grandpa would have loved this. The car running again, the workshop, the foundation, all of it. But especially this just sitting on a porch with people we care about, not rushing to be somewhere else. Alexander thought about his father's letter, now framed and hanging in his Manhattan office as a reminder of what truly mattered. The old man had been right about almost everything. The importance of presence over productivity, relationships over achievements, the danger of postponing life until a more convenient time. "I think you're right," Alexander said. "I think he would have been proud to see his car bringing people together, instead of just carrying them from one obligation to the next." As the sun set over the Pennsylvania countryside and the Fisher family began their evening routines, Alexander sat beside his son in comfortable silence, listening to the peaceful sounds of a life lived at the proper pace. The Jaguar sat in the driveway, ready for whatever journey might come next. Its restored engine cool and content after another day of doing exactly what it had been designed to do. Some repairs, Alexander had learned, took more than mechanical skill. They took patience, understanding, and the willingness to strip away everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. But when done properly, with care and attention and respect for what had come before, those repairs could last. For generations, the car would run for many years to come. But more importantly, so would the relationships it had helped to restore, carrying their passengers toward destinations that measured success in Sunday drives shared, wisdom passed down, and the quiet satisfaction that came from building something lasting in a world too often focused on what could be quickly consumed and discarded. In the end, that was the real miracle. Not that a broken machine had been made to run again, but that broken people had remembered how to be whole.